Welcome back to Priceless Advice with and for leaders of volunteers. I am delighted. I don't know why this is the first time I'm featuring the Beth Steinhorn of VQ Volunteer Strategies on the show. Welcome, Beth.
Very happy.
And we're in person.
I know, it's so exciting.
We're in New Orleans. We're in
Very
NOLA.
exciting.
Yeah,
That's
we happen to be at the Points of Light, so I'm glad that this worked out really, really well.
Yes.
And you're doing a couple sessions here.
I am doing a few sessions here. Yeah, I'm excited. We did one today. Both are co-presenting.
Okay.
So did one today with Nyla Hebert, the amazing Nyla from MAVA. And tomorrow I'm doing one with Tony Goodrow. So all on timely topics. And it's just great to be here with everybody.
Yay. Yeah, I love, this is my first time back in person to Points of Light since 2019. We did some of the virtuals early into COVID. In 2022, I was on the conference content committee, and you've been on that committee a number of times over the years.
In the past, and
helped with strategy. So you're absolutely a veteran and well respected and entrenched in the Points of Light audience and community, along with your company and your consulting. But talk about just what are some of the highlights of the topics you're doing, because this is going to air when, maybe you're here with us at the conference, but probably watching this a little later, and just seeing kind of, what you're dipping into with each of those topics in those sessions.
Sure. Well, interestingly, they're two separate things, but they're also interrelated, unsurprisingly. So today I did a session with Nyla Hebert, who's the executive director of MAVA, the Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer Advancement.
Yeah.
And we did a session called Small Investments, Big Impacts, which on one level features kind of the case study of how MAVA effectively, over the course of 8 years, advocated for and passed a state bill on volunteerism that led to funding for volunteer engagement in greater Minnesota, which means essentially rural Minnesota, outside of the Twin Cities. And so what were the big impacts from providing grants to 8 rural organizations that ranged from $15,000 to $40,000. So not huge investments,
but strategic and crucial.
Exactly. And the impacts and the ripple effects for these predominantly under-resourced organizations serving individuals who are at risk for homelessness, lapses in healthcare or education. There's a whole series of criteria. What were the impacts of these small investments? So on the one hand, it was about the advocacy and how they got there after 8 years and what have been the results of those investments. But on a greater level, it really was about the power of taking time to dream about what is possible when you engage volunteers in new ways, and setting time aside to rethink how engaging volunteers could be done, and what assets do you have, and what small investments might be needed. And we know it might seem tone deaf to talk about big state funding at a time when federal and state funds are being cut. But what we found with this room full of people was it's actually a perfect time to make sure that we don't give up on those things and are willing to think differently and be able to advocate more effectively for it.
And MAVA's been really leading the field in that kind of research and that kind of data collection. And anyone who subscribes to the channel knows the channel. Like, I talk about data and data storytelling a lot. I feature a lot of guests, and MAVA kind of leading the way, not only in DEI and inclusivity and that kind of thing, but finding that there is a very real positive impact when you can just do like these micro funding kind of like this, that it doesn't have to be in the millions or tens of millions. That's nice when that happens. That would be great. We're not turning that down. But these can have real world outcomes and impacts that can then be reported and hopefully build that momentum or gain that funders, snowball in how a little bit can go a long way, especially around strategic volunteer engagement.
And especially in small, under-resourced organizations that don't necessarily have dedicated volunteer engagement professionals. Or maybe they do, and their project is about creating partnerships among other small organizations in town. And how do you share resources? That's what some of these organizations did, was get funding to help 4 organizations come together in a coalition to share volunteer management software, or, there's lots of ways that they can have a big impact, a big bang for a small buck.
And that community connection is important. And it's sunsetted now. We were previously with the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, and what came out of that as a major outcome or product was the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement research a few years ago, which Points of Light happens to have incorporated into their From Nice to Necessary, and then they built on it, which is exactly what we wanted to happen. Is not to just sit in a corner and a few people go, oh, that's cool, but about that disconnect that often exists in lack of conversation or communication between organizational leaders and funders, and not getting specific funding earmarked or pointed to strategic volunteer engagement. And what Points of Light has done, and I've done another little Tuesday tips about that, to kind of breaking down the report and linking to it, but it seems like, all of this is connected.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We volunteered together on the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement. And then, as you said, it kind of connected to a larger coalition, the ISVE, the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement. That now has folded into Independent Sector, who is working to take it to the next level. And you can Google around, or you can just go to strategicvolunteerengagement.org, and it'll direct you straight to the Independent Sector. And so it's wonderful to see that now, we're not the only ones talking about this.
Not just
we still need more people around the table,
right?
But we are not the only ones talking about it. We have, with Points of Light, really, getting on the bandwagon and updating the research and expanding the research. We have much more of a strong corporate presence. In fact, I was at a lunch to talk about that. Nice to Necessary work with a group of folks from Points of Light and a few other folks from around the sector or cross sector. And I was sitting at a table with corporate folks and with a number of other folks from the sector and from Points of Light, talking about who else needs to be at the table.
Right.
So we're happy corporate is there. We're happy that faith-based are there. We're happy that, nonprofit. We need additional government and public sector folks. Some are present, but we need more foundation folks to really help continue to expand the conversation, especially in these times of budget cuts.
Right.
To recognize that while, I can borrow from our mutual friend Rob Jackson, while volunteers give their time freely, they are not free to engage and support. So we need to invest in this. So we, as leaders of volunteers or as leaders of nonprofits, need to be advocating for this. And there's an increased number of tools that can help with that. So the From Nice to Necessary is a great tool. The Activating Conversations Guide from ISVE is another great one. And we all need to continue to advocate internally to executive leadership. I firmly believe that one of the groups that's been missing from the table are fundraisers.
Yeah,
that
kind of the most important group.
Yeah. They have the ears of the executive directors.
Yeah, they bring the money in and they can help direct where it goes.
And they're the ones who make the asks to the foundations.
Exactly.
And what we learned from the 2022 research was, it's not that foundations won't invest in volunteer engagement. What they said was, EDs aren't asking for it.
Yeah.
And so we need to start making those asks. And that means that at all levels of the organization, leaders of volunteers, executives, we need to make the case of why investing in volunteer engagement is vital and be able to demonstrate what that return is.
So that's the data-driven thing. Like, data-driven is such a buzzword right now, and it's a whole thing. And we want human-centered and data-driven, ideally in a real balance, not just too much of one or the other. But that ties also into the impact session that you're doing with Tony Goodrow
tomorrow.
Yes.
Telling the whole story.
Yeah, connecting the pieces.
Yes.
Yeah.
Communicating volunteer impact, telling the whole story. And if you know Tony, he's looking at it. I mean, it's one of those, it's like a fun little, we're not in disagreement. We just come at things from two different lenses.
Yeah.
So we have a really nice, healthy tension about all the different ways that you might be able to tell the story of volunteer impact. Right. So yes, we have wage replacement. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to also highly elevate the work of Dr. Sue Carter-Kale and all the mission-centered.
We love Dr. Sue.
We love Dr. Sue. All of her mission-centered volunteer impacts, what would it look like if we asked the people who are closest to the volunteer activities, what that did for them, this quote unquote beneficiaries of the services, the volunteers themselves, the organizations, the community at large. What would that look like? And Tony also brings in this really much more robust economic impact look. And then we have a framework to help people determine who's the audience. And we don't think, and Tony likes to say, in any garden, you need a lot of different tools. You can't just use one. So we need different tools depending on our task of telling the story. So who's the audience, to whom are, what's the advocacy that we want out of them, and what's the right way to tell the story of volunteer involvement in that way. So that's what we're doing tomorrow.
Yeah, and I'm excited to pop into that, and I promise I won't heckle. I'm trying to seal my friends' sessions, and I'll
bring the hook.
I'm not going to bring the hook or any tomatoes or eggs or anything. But I think that's that important connection that as I'm hearing conversations at the conference too, even in other topics. We talk about this with each other and other people and our clients all the time. And I find for myself, at least speaking for myself, but maybe you agree, that I forget that other people don't know everything that we know. And that they don't even think about it. They don't have the luxury
all this time on it.
They don't have the luxury or the time. They're just frantically trying to survive as as volunteer coordinator, middle management. Sometimes
deliver programs,
get somebody scheduled. And so that's a very, understandable reason to, it took me years to realize that, I could get my CVA, I can join Alive. The new executive director of Alive, Nicole R. Smith, 6 years ago, I was like, have you heard of Alive? In a conversation with her. She's like, I haven't. Like, well, you should check it out. And look what's happened now. Look what's happened now. I try to connect people in conversations as much as I can. But that idea that not assuming that everybody understands or knows things, but also what I think you do a really great job of with your VQ volunteer strategies and your templates and the way that you work with organizations is you have very easy to use kind of like templates and things to follow. Your quiz is really great, kind of VQ score quiz, assessment type things that if somebody doesn't fully know everything that is in our brains from all these decades of doing this, that it can lead them through that process of really thinking about that. So did you have a process of coming up with that on your own in your experience, or how did I'm because it's somewhat simplified of a complex thing, but it still brings out complexity is what I think when I
so no one's ever asked me that question before. So I think I have two answers to it. One is that we always field test. We don't just train, we collaborate with organizations. So we're able to field test, whether they're position descriptions or assessments or evaluation tools, whatever it is, we field test those and then say, okay, now how do we generalize it and make it available? So I think that's a piece that helps. And the other is that I never thought of it in this way before, but I came into this field from a background in education. So I worked in informal education in museums, and sort of my superpower was taking really complex ideas and turning them into simple or label copy or layered content, working with our exhibit staff.
What the docents talk about.
Develop them into programs for our paid staff or our docents. So that is something that I love to do. I didn't think of it as applying to our templates, but that's what I spent the first part of my career doing, was taking complex, whether it was scientific information or cultural information, and making it accessible. So maybe there's a little bit of that legacy thrown in there.
I think that makes sense for where that skill and knowledge develops, because it is specific. And I've done that to a somewhat similar degree, not to the level of, creating that kind of assessment. I tend to customize assessments for my clients these days, but coming from conservation and teaching a lot of zoo docents and land preservation and parks and rec docents, like, okay, this is how you talk about it for a 7 to 10-year-old. This is how you talk about it for teenagers or adults.
Not
it's
that
not
you're
that
saying
different.
this. It's also, it's not about dumbing anything down.
No,
It's about making it accessible.
Exactly.
And, to use a museum term, curating the information for the biggest impact.
Right.
So
and the widest accessibility. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. I just that kind of just came to me as well. Like,
there you go.
There we go. It's like how inside behind the curtain of the process of the genius of Beth and VQ volunteer strategies. But talking about data-driven results, kind of circling back to the funder conversation and the work that the focus groups and that Dr. Sue did for Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, ISVE. We also worked with the Do Good Institute, who did a survey. And the main result of that, spoiler alert from a few years ago, is that the funders will fund things when they have the data that proves that impact. So that kind of circles back to the kind of information and data that MAVA has been collecting with these kind of smaller funded programs where community collaboration leads to this kind of success that they couldn't do by them. They couldn't afford volunteer management software one by one, but they can collaborate and get a subscription to Better Impact or Galaxy or whatever other product is out there that's good for your group. It's fascinating to me that the Points of Light research with Bridgespan group then built on that knowledge and did more surveys, more research, pulled in more studies that of all the corporate giving, and we want them at the table, like you said. I'm glad that they were at your lunch table today. But I believe the statistic was it was 0.0 something, like 0.03.
Actually, I believe only because I just saw this on the slide.
If you just saw it, please correct me.
0.19%.
That's right. 0 point something.
Corporate
giving.
Or I don't know that it was just corporate. Of foundation giving went to volunteer engagement infrastructure. And let's be really clear. This was not 19%.
Nope.
This was 0.19. So
0
less
point.
than a fifth of 1%.
Itty bitty amount.
Specifically to volunteer engagement.
Right. And that kind of shocked me because we get a lot of PR from companies. We get a lot of nonprofit washing, if you will, of like, look at what our CSR is, our corporate social responsibility is doing. But when Points of Light and Bridgespan crunch the numbers, it's this itty bitty amount.
Tiny amount.
And knowing CSR professionals like Jerome Tennille used to be in that field as well. We know from our friends and colleagues. That's right. Our friends and colleagues are like, I'm a department of one. There's not necessarily related to the size or value of a corporation equal to the impact that may be occurring. And
it was
foundational giving.
So one of the things that I think we need to, and I'm going to answer that question with the lens of what can leaders of volunteers
That's
do?
What I mean.
Because there's a big piece that I think we need philanthropy at the table.
Right.
We may not independently be able to get the large foundations at the table, though we can all play a role in that, and we can certainly get our local community foundations at the table. But I think a big piece of it is embracing our role as internal advocates and leaders of volunteer engagement within our organizations. So what does that mean in this particular instance? One, we need to educate and train colleagues across the institution about the power of volunteerism. And so if we do that through training, if we do that through working with HR to make sure that volunteer engagement is included in new employee orientation, if we do that so that we can make sure that not only are there 2 1-hour webinars every year on volunteer engagement or however often, but that we're also informally going to other department meetings or meeting with other staff whose titles don't include volunteer engagement and providing coaching on volunteer engagement. And if we, I worked with an organization in the Florida Keys who have just a Word document that is their this is our checklist of things. If there's a new initiative that you want to propose, what are the things you need to write up to propose it? And through their training and accreditation as a service enterprise, they realized that they should add 1 or 2 bullets that says, how could volunteers be engaged in this initiative? And what resources would be needed to make that happen?
Right.
When we integrate volunteer engagement into programmatic thinking, operational thinking, like marketing support, et cetera.
Strategic volunteer engagement.
Right.
Yeah.
Then we will begin to turn the big ship will turn in these little teeny ticks out in the ocean, and we'll really change direction, because then when the program people work with development to put together a grant proposal for some new fabulous meal program or tutoring program or conservation program, whatever it is, they will include the support needed to engage volunteers effectively in that work in the initial proposal rather than as an afterthought.
Yeah.
And that's what begins to change the culture. But that's one thing we can do, is work with fund development, work with our colleagues, so that when they're thinking about new programs, program expansion, new services, and efficiencies in operations, they can begin to be thinking at the start, how could volunteers be engaged, and when we ask for funding, what resources are we going to ask for, so that volunteers are viewed not as a money saver, but as a resource multiplier.
Yeah, and we know that there is a return on investment in putting funding towards strategic volunteer engagement. Sterling Volunteers has literally a calculator. You plug some numbers in from your agency and your program, and you figure out, I used their calculator with a zoo client a few years ago, and for every dollar they spent on volunteer services, they got $9 in return.
Volunteer value.
And volunteer value between membership, donorship, care of the animals, staff support, community engagement, getting word of mouth out. As volunteers are some of the best advocates and advertisers that we have. A happy volunteer is going to tell everybody and get more people on board. Someone having a bad experience is also going to talk about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. And I love that those are the sessions that are here, because they do relate to each other. They relate to the larger conversations we're having. I'm also hearing at the conference, I just got out of the session that was about disaster volunteering at federal and state and local levels, and chaos in federal funding, cuts to AmeriCorps, disbanding of NCCC type of AmeriCorps for disaster response. Like, these are all things that people are thinking about. I've had other videos and conversations with colleagues about it. And one of the points in that session is also with America's Service Commissions, was that we just need, some sort of answer can then be dealt with. Like, is it yes? Is it no? Is it in between? How much money? How much cuts? But the uncertainty and the chaos makes it so much more difficult to come up with any kind of plan, come up with any kind of budget. You work a lot, I know, with municipalities and other big organizations. Have you been seeing something with kind of local cities or counties, even in the last year, but especially in the last few months, with how are they dealing with, we may or may not have federal dollars, or suddenly we don't have the federal dollars that supported the specific program that volunteers are involved with, or that supports members of our community, that this government agency is trying to do their social safety net job, or even Parks and Rec, or something that's good for community health?
I do work with, it's admittedly a small data set in terms of big data, but I work with a handful of municipalities. I'm actually doing a session next week with a small to mid-sized city about trends in volunteer engagement, because they want to understand what's been happening at a national level. They know what's happening internally, and what they know is that while they have historically been a very well-funded and very supportive, a city that really supports volunteer engagement and community engagement in very real ways, and knows the investment that it takes. One of the few cities, small to mid-sized, that have dedicated leader of volunteers plus all the programmatic people. So they have this collaborative that comes together regularly.
More of that,
across
please.
The city, exactly. But they are facing budget crunches and trying to prioritize and figuring out, how do we make sure that amid this ever-changing funding environment, we're also still staying ahead of the curve in terms of volunteer trends. They want to know, what's the trend in family volunteering? Is, what's happening with corporate? Is it on the rise? Is it, we're in some ways COVID's ancient history. In other ways, people are still just sort of shaking off the dust and coming back out.
Mm-hmm.
But they're looking at that in a moment of tension and anxiety with a lot of uncertainty. So I'd say that cities are facing budget cuts, as are counties,
Yep.
and as are states.
Mm-hmm.
So the uncertainty is exhausting.
Yeah, and it really is. And that, there's a lot of, self-care for leaders and volunteers and, that kind of thing. But there's a certain point where systemic problems, you can't yoga your way out of federal budget cuts.
Well,
you can't green smoothie your way out of financial distress.
The other thing, though, and I'm not sure, maybe you can weigh in on this, Dana, as well. The other thing that's happening with all of this is the high staff churn.
Right.
I
New
don't want
people
to say
relearning.
Unprecedented, because there was precedent, generationally, but because of COVID, we've lost a significant percentage of experienced volunteer engagement leaders. Right. And even where there are experienced volunteer engagement leaders, they're working with colleagues who have likely been in their position for 2 years or less.
Right.
Whether they are a national health organization that helps raise funds to find cures for various, significant diseases, or a local county or city government, or a small animal shelter, whatever it is, there is by and large a lot of employee churn, which means we lose a significant amount of institutional knowledge and history and culture. And so that I still think there's some anxiety and some concern about the funding piece, but there's less legacy ingrained to make sure that volunteer engagement is sustained rather than cut. So that's a fear that I have for the sector.
I'm seeing that too.
For you to weigh in.
Yeah. I'm seeing that too. I'm seeing it from, we're talking about lenses and perspective and kind of, what someone's background or expertise lends them to view things through different lenses. I'm seeing it in webinars that I do for a regular basis for VMS companies, where for the last couple of years, I've seen, here's some return people to the audience that come, and they're open to everybody, but it tends to be the clients of the VMS company that sign up because they get the newsletter. But we try to publicize hey, it's free to everybody. Galaxy does this unit stuff, Galaxy, whatever. But there's more and more in the last year specifically. So it's technically COVID is still ongoing, and the impacts are still ongoing, but it was such a shock to the system in the first couple of years, and having to shut everything down and not knowing what was going to happen. But in the last year, I've noticed there's more and more people coming into the webinars that I do once or twice a month with, usually the regular same kind of audience, just different topics that I just started. I got moved laterally. This department got cut. I was a development assistant. So I think those are related of the budget cuts. And then, we're going down to a department of one, and the senior most expensive person with the pension or was close to retirement, the Gen Xers are like, here you go. And the people that are really doing their best and sincerely wanting to learn are coming in and trying to just drink from the fire hose and figure out how everything works. And so that's a role where service, if an organization's been certified in service enterprise, and you can talk a little bit about that, then at least they're teaching kind of all of the staff, and everybody in the organization is ideally getting on board.
Enough is still there after all the churn.
That if there's some churn, but more and more I'm seeing that, a department of 3 or 4 that was doing pretty well with a government agency or a smaller, medium-sized nonprofit becomes a department of 1. And then a recent client that I worked with last year had someone who, he was very qualified, but he had been with that agency for 1 year. And then there were so few other staffs and a 50% cut to his volunteer services budget that in 2025, he suddenly had 3 other people's jobs and half the money from one department and none from those departments to try to do the same thing. And the budget left was enough to maybe go to 3 booth events and not do anything else. And so again, sometimes you can't get through the math to get to it. Yeah.
And that's where, none of that is a sustainable piece.
It isn't.
But getting back to your first question, just a little bit about conference, if budgets and time allow, the value of a conference, especially an in-person one, even though I think that virtual ones are great too, it forces you outside your tyranny of the daily urgent, your daily tyranny of the urgent, whatever.
The to-do list tyranny.
In order to just step out and think differently and meet people and reflect and hear about other solutions. And that's, you mentioned service enterprise. That's really one of the greatest benefits of the service enterprise training and accreditation program. The end game is that an organization has a plan together and gets recognized as an organization that truly centers volunteer engagement as a core strategic function, meets a critical mass of research-based standards that demonstrate excellence in volunteer engagement, and then is awarded an accreditation with a pretty seal that is valid for 3 years. And it acknowledges to funders, to volunteers, or prospective funders, to prospective volunteers, to staff, to current employees, et cetera, that this is an organization that fundamentally leverages volunteers and their skills to achieve their social mission. This isn't about a program. This is about a key strategy for mission fulfillment. And yet, while there are lots of great benefits to that, what I hear over and over again from the dozens and dozens of organizations I've trained and accredited or reaccredited is that they say, oh, yeah, we're happy to have the badge. My CEO is really competitive. They love a good, accreditation or whatever the reasoning
love a shiny
is.
Thing.
Exactly. Yeah. But the real value was being held accountable to get everyone around the table, to meet with you for the 16 hours of training over the course of a couple months, to have our coaching calls, to work on this together, to get different voices in the room, and to be accountable for setting aside time to think strategically about this. That is almost to a T what every single group says at the end when we say, what did that do? When we're at the site visit to determine if they're to do the kind of the final audit and determine if they're ready to be recommended for accreditation, they almost all say, oh yeah, we want the shiny thing, but we've already won.
Yeah. And it's the old saying of, it's the journey, not the destination.
Yes,
and
exactly.
it's the communication, not just the one workshop or the one webinar. Right. As much as we love doing workshops and webinars all the time, you and I and Jennifer Bennett, who's here as well, and did a Priceless advice last month, we will be the first to say that's a start. Yes. That's just an introduction to a topic, to some highlights, and then here's some more resources to do it. And Service Enterprise is housed now with ALIVE, the Association of Leaders of Volunteer Engagement. I'll have the link down below. We've talked about that before. So we've talked a little bit about what we're hearing in our sessions, some of the Q&A, watching other colleagues. I think that conference experience of coming together, and like you mentioned earlier, just getting out of that day-to-day stress or vibe, or myopic focus that's necessary to get the job done for very many people. I see a joy light up in people's faces where they make new connections, or they recognize you or Jennifer or me, where they've seen us on videos, or they saw us, years ago at Points of Light, and making that connection, but also that expansion of ideas and perspectives, I think, is so valuable. And just people realizing that I'm not the only one that goes through this.
Well, that's what I was thinking of, is that chance to not, it's so easy to feel alone amid especially challenging, prolonged, isn't that where we started?
Stress.
Prolonged stress and challenging times. It's easy to feel alone, and being able to come together at a conference, trite as it may seem, is really a great chance to, yes, to network, but also to really connect and have shared experiences in ways that people in our own families, in our own world, and don't necessarily understand. So to first and foremost, it's always great to be able to connect with people. It's great to be able to learn and take home some new tactics and some strategies. It's also, I think, really important for me to be somewhere where there is, I don't think it's hollow, but I think a real sincere narrative about hope. That
Absolutely.
It is about
hope is an action verb.
We have some really challenging, many of our organizations, not all of them, there are still organizations out there that are just business as usual and moving forward, and that's great for them.
Great for them.
They're important. And if you have that,
enjoy it.
Enjoy it and keep moving forward and keep the field moving forward.
Do the good work every day.
Right. And for those who are struggling or have a lot of uncertainties due to funding cuts or other shifts in policy or whatever it is, it is really helpful to be in a place where there's hope. And I will say, even though I have some insights into Points of Light, but I'm not on their payroll. I don't,
me neither.
It still is really wonderful to be at a Points of Light conference and see and hear inklings of what's coming down the road from them.
Mm-hmm.
They are very hopeful and proactive about not just increasing volunteerism, but recognizing, you can see this in the report,
mm-hmm.
that in order to make that happen and increase volunteer-driven impact, we need to build the capacity of organizations, public sector, nonprofits, et cetera. We need to invest in volunteer engagement. We need to make sure that there are tools and skills and resources to help organizations do that, that the recipe doesn't work if it's all just about let's double the number of volunteers and they're going to go knock on doors and organizations are not going to be able to engage them. And so I'm encouraged and hopeful with this, I think more than a narrative, with this commitment, and excited to see how we can each play our role in that happening. Obviously, the part for me that's personally really exciting is less about the numbers of volunteers and more about the capacity of organizations to effectively engage volunteers for their mission. Doubling numbers or not, that's what I really want to see, because that's work that's needed to happen not just in the last 5 months or in the last 5 years. It's needed to happen for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
And so that's exciting to see that get another sort of accelerating kick in the tush.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, and sometimes you need a little fire or a little kick, in getting that going. And Points of Light being such a big player in the sector and globally, when they start to again release the From Nice to Necessary research, we've talked about that. All of that'll be linked in the video description below. But for you and I working for some years with a little volunteer alliance, scrappy, kind of under the radar, getting this cool study out, getting it to be housed with another big player like independent sector, it feels like, it's a relief, and it's a proud success moment where we can just kind of enjoy that for a moment. And seeing now that Points of Light has built on that research, has this momentum, is helping to just keep hope as a real action, because that's what it is. Hope is not, it has to be its own verb. It has to be turned into day-to-day practices. They don't have to be complicated. They don't have to be difficult. Exactly. In fact, most of the time it's just, can you reflect kindness? Can you find community with people? Can you get a new idea from a colleague?
And to that end, I think we each have a role to play in telling our stories.
Yeah.
Because even if you're not in a large national, multi-layered national enterprise organization, if you have had one innovation or one really successful volunteer engagement, volunteer-driven impact, or a pilot that's gone really well, more than ever, it's easy to share that. You can blog about it. You can contact either of us. We'll help amplify the story. Yeah. You can
come on the channel
to engage.
Submit it to engage for an article.
There are so many ways, and one of the things that we need in order to move this this investment conversation forward is, crazy as it is, more stories of success.
Yeah.
And so that's a way we can each contribute, and no story is too small.
It isn't, and that's been really the whole point of my channel, not just as an excuse, as I've said before, to talk to my friends and get to see them in person or on Zoom, or just have conversations. This, really started with Rob Jackson in London in late January of 2020. So that was,
there you go.
It's been a journey from that moment. But I encourage folks to send in your own videos of Tuesday tips, your ideas for Tuesday tips. Nice. I feature day-to-day practitioners, people that are more well-known, people that are up and coming. A lot of the really great hit presenters here today. 3-4 years ago, I spotted, and I'm not even remotely taking credit for anybody else's success, but I like to meet interesting people doing interesting things in the field, and I love to watch them glow up and blow up. in
I have
the
a few
spotlight.
suggestions for you from the conference.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Well,
we'll do
then
some introductions.
spoiler alert.
I know.
We're gonna get some fresh new
Get a
faces
few
on the
people. Yeah,
channel. But
yeah.
yeah, that's the point of Priceless Advice with and for leaders of volunteers. It's not only, you know, we happen to be consultants, we happen to have been doing this for a long time, but the folks that I just found at other conferences and thought, you're doing something really cool, or we had a really cool conversation. Can we reschedule to, you know, record that
Yeah.
conversation on Zoom? And now to see, you know, Bruna Dorelis blowing up, and
Yes.
Nicole R. Smith, again, like presenting for the first time at Points of Light, the executive director of Alive, and knowing her for a few years. I just love seeing the success of colleagues in the field because of these connections that we find at conference. And so much of it is not just specific to Points of Light, although this is, you know, typically the biggest national conference. But next year, Alive's going to have its first summit in Sacramento in 2026. Right. And since I'm in California, Points of Light is going to be in Long Beach in 2027.
Yes,
DC, Washington, DC, 2026. So I'm just excited that anything is going to happen on the West Coast.
Got it.
And that, yeah, won't necessarily have to travel super far to do this. But thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking.
I can't believe it
Thanks
took
for watching.
It took for this. Thanks for watching, and all the contact info to connect with Beth, get in touch with her, VQ Volunteer Strategies, all the amazing work that you do with your clients. People can find you there. And yes. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And please share this video if you enjoyed it. We do want to get the word out of these conversations and create more connections for folks, whether it's at conferences or online or in any way that we can with other leaders of volunteers. So thanks so much.
Thank you.